We are surrounded by noise, but not just any noise. It is a continuous, invisible noise that infiltrates our minds without us noticing. It is notifications, endless feeds, empty conversations, and constant stimuli that hijack our attention and empty our presence. Deep down, today's society is a cult of noise. Those who remain silent are seen as disturbing. Those who distance themselves are judged as arrogant, strange, even dangerous. But what few realize is that all this noise hides a collective fear, the dread of emptiness. Silence, for most people, is unbearable because it forces individuals to face themselves. If this topic resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. Nietzsche saw this more than a century ago. For him, the noise of the world was an anesthetic, an existential escape. Modern man talks too much, listens too little, and thinks almost never. Constant noise prevents us from hearing what really matters, our own consciousness. Silence, then, is not absence. It is pure presence. It is the space where ideas are formed, where identity is built. What's more, it is where strength is born. Not the strength of those who shout to impose themselves, but the strength of those who remain silent in order to observe, filter, understand, and then act with precision. But this strength is dangerous to a system that profits from distraction, because those who discover the power of silence become more difficult to manipulate, less predictable, more centered, and therefore freer. That is why, today, practicing silence is an act of resistance. It is as if we were saying, "No, I don't have to react to everything. I don't have to have an opinion on everything. I don't have to be available all the time." The proposal here is not to become a monk. It is to regain control over your own attention. It is to train your mind to function without stimulation, and it starts with a radically simple gesture: closing your eyes, turning everything off, and facing 30 minutes of darkness and absolute silence. But what does Nietzsche have to do with this? Everything, because he was one of the few who understood. The man who learns to be alone, without running away from himself, no longer has anything to prove to the world. Nietzsche did not isolate himself because he hated the world. He withdrew because he wanted to see it clearly. For him, loneliness was not a punishment, it was a condition. Silence, far from the crowd, was the fertile ground where truly original ideas could flourish. He rode in the mountains, walked through forests, avoided cities. Not out of misanthropy, but out of lucidity. The greatness of man lies in being a bridge and not an end, he said. But to build that bridge, you need silence. You need seclusion. Nietzsche understood something that we have forgotten today. When we are always surrounded by other people's voices, we lose our own. The crowd dissolves identity. Excessive coexistence robs us of our individuality. Collective noise dulls the mind. That is why he advocated voluntary isolation, not as an escape but as a new beginning. Withdrawing to rebuild oneself, silencing oneself in order to listen to oneself. It is no wonder that his texts still make people uncomfortable. They were conceived in a vacuum, far from easy applause and ready-made truths. Nietzsche saw man as something to be overcome, an unfinished project. And this overcoming does not happen in the noise of society, but in courageous introspection, the kind of introspection that only deep silence allows. Voluntary isolation, then, is more than a luxury. It is a philosophical requirement. It is the moment when human beings disconnect from external distractions to reevaluate their own convictions. And when that happens, when individuals stop, observe, think, they become dangerous, because they begin to act with intention. They begin to choose what they consume, who they talk to, where they go. They become less reactive, more strategic. Nietzsche would call this the will to power, vital energy channeled into creating oneself rather than pleasing others. This deliberate silence is not comfortable. It hurts, it exposes, it confronts, but it also heals, and it transforms. So when someone decides to withdraw by choice, even if only for 30 minutes a day, they are doing more than a mental experiment. They are repeating an ancestral gesture, leaving the world to return different. Popular culture still associates silence with weakness. Those who are silent have lost. Those who do not respond are absent. Those who walk away give up. But this shallow interpretation reveals more about those who judge than those who remain silent. Nietzsche already warned us. What appears to be weakness is often hidden strength. Silence is not the absence of a response. It is a refusal to react on someone else's terms. It is an invisible form of control, a restraint that requires more courage than an impulsive response. In practice, silence, when used well, is a strategy of power. It frightens because it breaks the pattern. Everyone is expected to react, give their opinion, take a stand every second. Silence in this scenario becomes a rupture. Those who remain silent are not out of the game, they are above it. Nietzsche spoke of free spirits, those who do not allow themselves to be captured by the noise of collective morality, ready-made speeches, and dogmas of the moment. And to be a free spirit, one must first silence the world within oneself. Silence reveals. It shows what speech hides. It shows where fear lies, where anxiety dwells, where insecurity lives. It lets the mask fall. That is why it is so uncomfortable. That is why it is avoided. But it is precisely this discomfort that reveals its value. It is when silence becomes unbearable that we realize how dependent we are on external stimuli to exist. When we can't stay quiet for 10 minutes, the problem isn't with the silence. It's with us. Nietzsche was never a defender of conformity, but he understood that before acting against the world, one must understand oneself outside of it. Silence is that interval. It is the space between stimulus and response, and those who master that interval master themselves. More than that, those who learn to be silent learn to observe, to listen to what others don't say, to perceive what lies between the lines. Silence develops perception, and perception is the first step toward true intelligence. In the age of quick reactions, responding with silence is like delivering an invisible checkmate. The other person thinks they have won, but the real winner is the one who maintained control. Light protects us. It illuminates, reveals, and provides comfort. But it is in the dark that the harshest truths reside. Nietzsche knew this. For him, darkness was a symbolic portal, not to death, but to the birth of self-awareness. When the light goes out, the stimuli cease. The eyes have nothing to entertain themselves with. The body has nowhere to run. All that remains is what was previously muffled. Thoughts, sensations, memories, internal voices that were previously ignored. When not filled with distractions, darkness becomes a mirror, but not a physical mirror, a mental mirror. And the image it reflects is not appearance, but essence. Without light, there is no makeup, only truth. Nietzsche treated existence as something to be faced, not denied. And facing requires seeing, even in the dark, especially in the dark, because that is where the most primitive impulses, the deepest fears, and the thoughts we avoid during the day arise. That is why the simple act of turning off the lights and remaining in absolute silence before going to sleep can become a brutal philosophical experience. Because in that total emptiness, the mind begins to reveal who you really are, not who you pretend to be. Most people can't stand it. When distractions disappear, anxiety appears. Time drags on. A nameless restlessness arises, only a feeling. But this discomfort is revealing. It shows how much we depend on the outside world to escape ourselves. Nietzsche said, "Become who you are," but that requires a journey. And darkness is the beginning of that journey. It's like descending into your own inner cave, like facing the minotaur you've hidden inside. Nothing there is pleasant, nothing is predictable, but everything is necessary, because it is only in the dark that certain truths dare to appear. And when you get used to this darkness, something changes. You begin to see with your eyes closed, to listen deeply, to feel what you previously ignored. The dark ceases to be a threat and becomes an ally. When the noise stops and the lights go out, the body slows down, but the mind awakens. Silence and darkness are not empty. They are amplifiers. They make everything that is muffled inside you gain volume, clarity, shape. Nietzsche knew this mechanism deeply. He wrote in states of high introspection, and he knew that true thought is not born from noise, but from listening. When the body is silent, the mind finally has space to emerge unfiltered. That's when the thoughts you avoid appear. Sometimes they are single phrases. Others are uncomfortable images. Memories that were forgotten, decisions you put off, truths you pushed under the mental rug. What emerges in absolute silence is not random. It is what your unconscious has always wanted to tell you, but never had the opportunity. Because in your daily life you are too busy reacting, too distracted running away, too tired to listen. Nietzsche said that the greatest battles are fought within. He wasn't talking about battles against others, but against what is inside you. Pride, fear, vanity, lies, guilt. All of this begins to echo when silence sets in. It's as if by silencing your body you open a mental theater, and the characters that emerge there are the fragmented pieces of who you are, or who you no longer want to be. That's why many give up simple practices like nighttime silence, because what comes to the surface isn't pretty, but it's real, and the real, when seen head-on, has the power to transform. Nietzsche called this facing the abyss, and he warned, if you look long enough into an abyss, the abyss looks back at you. This is not a threat, it is a warning. You must be willing to hold your gaze. When uninterrupted, the mind reveals secrets, and some of those secrets change your course, but only those who can bear to hear what no one else can hear, what comes from within, are capable of transforming noise into clarity. Everyone talks about peace, but few can bear silence. Because when the sound of the world disappears, the mind reveals what really dwells there, and what often appears is an agonizing emptiness. Nietzsche saw this anguish not as a mistake, but as a sign. The discomfort in the face of emptiness is proof that we are addicted to distraction. We need something all the time. A video, a message, a song, a feed. Silence becomes withdrawal. This addiction is modern, but the structure is ancient. Human beings have always been afraid of nothingness. Nothingness is frightening because it dismantles certainties, because it gives us nothing to occupy ourselves with. And keeping ourselves busy has become the anesthesia of the century. But Nietzsche proposes another route, not to flee from emptiness, but to dive into it. To face anguish not as a failure of the system, but as an opportunity for reconstruction. He saw pain as a springboard to strength, discomfort as a test of maturity, and uncomfortable silence as a transitional phase, like the creaking of the old self about to be dismantled. The problem is that our culture has turned discomfort into an enemy. We are always trying to improve our mood, increase productivity, optimize our routine. But what if the cure is not in improving, but in stopping, in facing what emerges when nothing else distracts us? This anguish of emptiness is not the end. It is the beginning of a psychic cleansing. The beginning of truly observing who you have become, and perhaps who you no longer want to be. Nietzsche would say that this is the price of lucidity, seeing the world as it is, and seeing yourself as you are, without emotional makeup, without illusions of belonging. Some will run away. They will return to the noise, to the lights, to empty conversations. But others, those who endure, will go through this pain and come out the other side with a strength that cannot be bought, taught, or faked. The strength of those who no longer fear their own emptiness. There is a kind of silence that is not escape. It is preparation. It is not absence. It is accumulation. Nietzsche understood this tactical silence as a way to preserve energy, recalibrate focus, and act with greater precision. Most people live in reactive mode. Everything is an immediate response, an instant opinion, continuous exposure. But the more you expose yourself, the more vulnerable you become, and the more you respond, the less you observe. Silence is the pause that restores the advantage. Nietzsche spoke of the importance of time of withdrawal, stepping away from the flow not out of weakness, but by choice, not to disappear, but to see better. Those who withdraw strategically do not isolate themselves from the world. They position themselves above it. It's like a game of chess. There are times when the most powerful move is not to move. Wait, analyze, let the other person rush. Tactical silence is not neutral. It is active. While the world talks too much, you observe. While everyone else reacts, you study. While they wait for your response, you construct it carefully. That is mastery. That is contained power. Nietzsche was often misunderstood precisely because he did not respond to the attacks of his time. But he knew that responding to everything was falling into the trap of mediocrity. He chose his battles, and, Even more importantly, he chose his silences. The same logic applies to everyday life. Instead of arguing with everyone, be silent. Instead of trying to prove something, retreat. Instead of showing strength with words, demonstrate it with your presence. Because when silence is intentional, it becomes a code. People sense that there is something there, a latent force, a gaze that sees beyond. What's more, silence builds mystery, and mystery is a powerful resource. It prevents others from reading you completely. It prevents them from predicting your next move. Nietzsche used silence as a philosophical weapon. We can use it as a strategic tool. In a world that values noise, what is not said has more impact than any speech. Withdrawing, then, is a way to move forward without being noticed. It is the step back that prepares the decisive leap. Nietzsche believed that the clearest thinking comes from the deepest solitude. But how can we access this clarity in the chaos of everyday life? The proposal is simple and brutally effective. 30 minutes a day in total darkness and silence before going to sleep. It is not meditation. It is not guided relaxation. It is not an attempt to empty the mind. It is exactly the opposite. It is allowing the mind to speak without interruption. It is creating a ritual space where the superficial self has nowhere to run. This nightly ritual acts as a decompression chamber for the soul. By turning off the lights and silencing all sounds, you create a field of real introspection. No light, no sound, no screen, just presence. The first few days will be uncomfortable. Your mind will race. It will try to escape. Chaotic thoughts, confusing images, and uncomfortable sensations will arise. This is normal. It's your nervous system trying to return to its natural state after years of overstimulation. But as you persist with this simple gesture, something begins to change. Your mind slows down. Your thoughts stop racing. They begin to walk. You notice patterns. You hear internal phrases repeating themselves. You recognize pains that were muffled. Nietzsche would call this a return to the underground of consciousness. That is where original ideas live. That is where you find not answers, but better questions. The time before bed is strategic. It is when the brain is most sensitive, most receptive. It is when the mind, free from the pressures of the day, reveals its deepest layers. This 30-minute ritual then becomes a daily portal, a crossing, a philosophical gesture. By doing it every day, you not only improve your sleep, you reconfigure your perception. More importantly, you begin to regain a kind of mental autonomy that the world wants to erase. The autonomy of being with yourself without going crazy. The courage to listen to your own voice, without background music. Nietzsche proposed that each individual should be their own experiment. These 30 minutes are just that, an experiment in lucidity. And like any real experiment, the effects are not immediate, but they are inevitable. 30 minutes in the dark and silent. It seems like nothing, but when repeated every day, this gesture becomes an internal revolution, because what seemed like discomfort becomes fertile ground for perception. Nietzsche believed that human beings only become truly strong when they learn to sustain their own presence. And that is exactly what begins to happen. Individuals stop seeking refuge outside themselves and begin to stabilize within. The first changes are subtle. A different kind of lucidity appears. The mind becomes clearer not because it is full of ideas, but because it is not saturated with garbage. Excessive thinking begins to reorganize itself. You don't think less, you think better. Over time, you notice a new internal rhythm. Anxiety decreases not because it has disappeared, but because it has lost its hold. The body acquires a different relationship with sleep. Sleeping is no longer an escape, it is a continuation of silence. But the most striking change is in your perception outside of those 30 minutes. The world seems slower, more predictable. You begin to see patterns of behavior, repetitions of speech. Noises that once seemed normal now sound absurd. It's like adjusting a camera lens. The focus changes, and with it, your response to the environment changes. You no longer engage in just any conversation. You no longer react to the first stimulus. You no longer explain yourself as much. Nietzsche would call this refinement of the will. The will that was once scattered in 1,000 directions is now channeled. You become selective, intentional. You gain presence. And presence changes everything. People around you begin to notice. They can't explain it, but they feel it. Your silence begins to have more impact than your words. Your absence makes more noise than your passive presence did before. Daily silence, then, ceases to be a practice and becomes a posture. It's not just before bedtime. It's in the midst of a crowd. It's in the midst of conflict. It's when faced with choices. You've learned to stand on your own 2 feet. And this kind of presence, Nietzsche knew well, cannot be taught. It can only be cultivated. In the dark, in silence, and in the courage not to run away. All of this, the discomfort, the withdrawal, the darkness, the stillness, is not an end. It is a means. Silence is not just spiritual practice, nor is it merely a technique for focus. It is, above all, a form of power. Nietzsche understood this like few others. For him, true strength does not lie in dominating others, but in not being dominated by anything. And silence is proof of this. Proof that you no longer depend on noise to exist. When you are silent inside, something organizes itself. When you accept emptiness, something is built. When you silence the world, something awakens. And that something is your center, your free will, your clarity. Silence takes you out of the crowd. It gives you back control. It turns you into a keen observer, and little by little, into a dangerous being. In the best sense, someone who thinks for themselves, feels for themselves, acts for themselves. Nietzsche called this process transvaluation, reversing values. What was once seen as weakness becomes strength. What once seemed like loss becomes power. You no longer need to shout. Your presence speaks. You don't need to defend yourself. Your energy filters. You don't need to convince anyone. Your lucidity is already unsettling. The 30-minute ritual is not just an exercise in silence. It is a gesture of insubordination. It is the refusal to be just another digital zombie. It is the rescue of the human being who thinks, observes, questions. And in the end, all of this points to a single achievement: freedom. Freedom of attention. Freedom of reaction. Freedom to be. Nietzsche didn't want followers. He wanted individuals. People who had the courage to walk alone, to think outside the noise, to exist with conviction. And perhaps in today's world, there is no greater revolution than a human being who knows how to be silent, and yet still impacts the world. Now the question remains, are you ready to shut everything out and listen to what only silence can reveal? If this content resonated with you, like the video. And if you've experienced this kind of silence or want to share your thoughts on it, leave a comment below.